Are we good to go over here? Hopefully. All right. Everybody hear me okay? I had a problem at the other church. The microphone was shorter. It was like my Pastor Mark size. So this one's a lot higher. Okay. Well, again, forgive me for my foibles this morning. I'm rough around the edges, as my wife will attest to. Not always perfect, even though I hate to admit it sometimes. So I have you for 2 weeks. I'm filling in for this week and next week. And I'm kind of passionate about the fruits of the Spirit, and that's in Galatians chapter 5. But I didn't want to really break that in half or split that up into the 2 weeks. I didn't really want the main point of that. And it's a big deal to me that everything is always in context. When you do messages from the Bible, too often people want to just pull out, we'll talk about just a couple of these verses and not really get the broader context of what's going on. And so what I'm going to do is this week we're going to do all of chapter 5. Well, I'm not doing all of it this week. I'm going to do all of chapter 5 over the 2 weeks. And so this week we're going to start out, and for those that want to follow along, I'm going to be looking at Galatians chapter 5, beginning with verse 1 and continuing through verse 15. And then next week I'll wrap up with the rest of the chapter. And this one is quite the interesting one to preach on, a topic that doesn't often come up in Sunday mornings. So if you want to follow along, Galatians chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Mark my words. I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourself be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. But by faith we eagerly await through the Spirit the righteousness for which we hope. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith, expressing itself through love. You were running a good race. Who cut in on you and kept you from obeying the truth? That kind of persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. I am confident in the Lord that you will take no other view. The one who is throwing you into confusion will pay the penalty, whoever he may be. Brothers, if I am still preaching circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been abolished. As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. You, my brothers, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature. Rather, serve one another in love. The entire law is summed up in a single command: love your neighbor as yourself. If you keep on biting and devouring each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. So circumcision, that's a word you don't always often have to deal with on a Sunday morning. But it's all about context, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't just jump into the part I love without covering, like, why is this even in the Bible and stuff like that. So one thing we have to know about context is, well, what are we reading? Well, we're reading the Bible, right? It's not just a book of good moral stories. It's not like Aesop's fables. It's not just a fiction book. It's not just a story book. It's a book of history. It's a book of things that really happened. And in this case, it's a book where we're reading from a letter the Apostle Paul wrote to the church of Galatia. So at some point, this part I don't know, I didn't research. I don't know who planted the church in Galatia. Maybe it was a result of Paul himself, because Paul was persecuting the Jews and Christians, or persecuting the Christian church when it first began, and then they got scattered out of Jerusalem and they went all over and planted a lot of churches. So maybe this might be the result of Paul's persecution, or it might be one that he planted himself. I'm not sure. I don't attest to know everything, but the fact is there was a church in Galatia, and Paul is writing this letter to them because they had an issue with some teaching in the church, and it was an issue related to the law, which is where the circumcision part comes in. And this is where it's good to know the history that's in the Bible. So in the beginning, God created Adam and Eve, and they walked with him in the garden and knew him personally. There really wasn't a law or any rules that we know of at that time. The Bible isn't really elaborate on details like that until we get to Abraham, until we get to later in Genesis, around chapters 15, 16 or so. And in the case of circumcision, we see that come out of the covenant between Abraham and God. And so what happened is God spoke to Abraham and said, hey, I want to make this promise to you. I want to make this covenant with you. If you will follow me, and you and your descendants will follow and obey me and worship me, then I will bless you. And in the way that he would bless him, that he spoke of, was through his progeneration, through his kids and children and grandchildren, and he would have many sons, right? Everybody knows the song, Father Abraham, many sons. Yeah, that's why I don't sing in church very much. Although I don't say no either, so when Pastor Dave had me sing with the guy, I said, don't remember that I said I don't say no, because I'll find a way to say no for something. But yeah, it's God promised him that. Now, part of the covenant, whenever God makes a covenant with his people, there is a shedding of blood in some way. Now, in the case of the Old Testament, what happened is God said, okay, now to show that you are followers of me, you all need to be circumcised. And circumcised, I like words. I like what words mean. It literally just means to cut around. So I'm not going to go into details about circumcision as we know it, but it means to cut around. And there's sometimes we speak of like circumcising our hearts, even to cut the sin out, and so that we remain with our love and that. But we'll think of it. Let's put it in a different way. Let's think of it this way. Let's think of it as a tattoo, right? And it would be like, okay, we're all followers of God here. We're all part of the Victory Club for God, and so we all have this victory tattoo. And so to be a part of the club, we have to have this victory tattoo. And so what happened in the Old Testament is if foreigners in the land in Israel, or new kids that were born as they got older, they would have to get this tattoo, and that would show that they were Jews, that they were followers of God. And that was part of the covenant. It was part of the promise. It was a little bit of them saying, okay, we're sacrificing this. We're doing this to show that we belong to this community, that we are committed to following God. And then the other part of the covenant that comes out later through Moses is the Ten Commandments and the books of the law. Leviticus, Deuteronomy talks of that and speaks of that more fully. But we know the law as the Ten Commandments. That's its purest form. But then what you had is you had a couple thousand years between Moses and the law and Jesus coming to fulfill the law and what God's intent was. And in that time frame, it only took 2,000 years for the Pharisees and the Sadducees, for human beings, to take what God had given us, which was a blessing. If you read around the Ten Commandments, it was like, here's this rules, here's how you should live. If you live this way, I will bless you and reward you. And it wasn't meant to be like, I'll punish you. It was meant to be a reward and a blessing, that if you follow and obey God and put him first, and you don't steal, and you honor your parents, and you remember the Sabbath day to rest and keep it holy, and don't commit adultery, and don't covet. You do those things, you'll have a good life. You'll be blessed. It wasn't to be like, don't do those things because I just don't want you to have fun. It was because the pure intent of it was to bless us and to make us holy unto God, to make us into that family, be a part of that communion that had been broken with Adam and Eve. Now the problem is we're sinful and we aren't able to obey, so that's the struggle that we have. Now in this, what happens then is Jesus comes along, he fulfills that law by taking the punishment for us, because we can't obey that law perfectly. We deserve God's wrath and punishment because we disobeyed him. From the beginning with Adam and Eve till today with us willingly disobeying. And the thing is, we can never take that punishment ourselves, so Jesus steps in, fulfills that law by living it perfectly, first of all, as a human and as God. And then fulfilling it through his death and taking the wrath and punishment for us. That's the reward. That's what Paul is speaking of when he starts out in verse 1. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. So that law kind of became a burden because it was like we needed to try to follow it to have a good life, and we would always fail at that. But that became the yoke that kind of we were bound by it. Like we couldn't get away from it. It was something that we needed to have, but also was a burden and made us slaves that we couldn't follow through and hold to. And Jesus comes and he takes that yoke, that burden from us by taking that punishment for us. So now, fast forward to there being Christians, and there's Christian churches. And in this case, the church of Galatia, Paul is writing to because that knowledge, like if it was us here, that knowledge within our group was being tainted. There were some people that were most likely former Pharisees, because the Christians at that time were mostly people that had been Jews before. And so they had all that history, they had all that law. But then you also had people that had no idea of the church, just like we have in our community. There's some people in our community, sadly, who had come from families that have no idea what church is, or maybe have never been in a church. And so you had people like that the Christians were witnessing to and saying, hey, we want to set you free from your sin and bring you to a relationship with God. And so then they would come into the church. They would come into the Galatian church, and they would learn about Jesus. But then you had the people that were already in the church that had the tattoos. They're in the club, right? And they're like, hey, to really be a part of Christ, you need to get circumcised, or you need to get the tattoo, or you need to follow these rules. And the problem was they didn't just have the 10 Commandment rules. They had a couple thousand years of making up their own rules and clarifying, what does it really mean to keep the Sabbath holy? Oh, you can't do this long list of things, otherwise you're not keeping it holy. They put all these criteria and twisted God's original intent and God's original word. Jesus even speaks to that when he sums up that really they've lost the intent. Here is what it means: love God and love your neighbor. And but that had been lost, and instead it became about what can we do? You know, if we follow these rules, then we're righteous, then we can get to heaven, then we can get to God. That was the twisted message. And Paul is speaking to this church because he's saying that the yeast of that message is filtering through the church. That bad idea, that wrong, twisted idea was getting passed within the Galatian church. Now I was curious, because I'd never looked it up before. I really like words and like what do they mean. So I was looking up yeast and leaven and stuff like that. And did you know yeast is a fungus? I didn't know yeast was a fungus until I looked it up. So it's just like mushrooms, toe fungus, nail fungus, and then there's yeast. And so usually we think of yeast as like a positive fungus though, because beer and bread, right? Those are the two main things, alcohol and bread. But the thing is, in all cases, yeast is something that takes the carbohydrate, that takes the sugar, and whether it's in bread or it's in barley mix for beer or whatever, and it converts the sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Now for bread, the carbon dioxide is great for us who eat it, because it's those air bubbles of the gas that make the bread taste better, because it's spongier and not just a solid brick of unleavened bread, right? Have you had unleavened bread before sometimes? Imagine if the only bread you were eating on sandwiches was communion wafers, right? Probably wouldn't be as enjoyable. Or imagine that your wife is trying to get you to eat healthier, so she's like, oh, I'll mix in some wheat flour, and then the yeast doesn't work, and you just end up with some really interesting creations. She may or may not have done that a couple times. There's a fine line of how much wheat flour you can put into regular flour. Don't experiment, it doesn't taste very good. But you don't get those bubbles. But the thing is, you see, like in the Old Testament, there was a lot of the laws had these different sacrifices, and you'd have unleavened bread. And that would be bread without the yeast and without the leaven, probably so that the carbon dioxide, so that the alcohol wouldn't be contaminating what was holy as a sacrifice to God. And that's the same thing that happens here. The yeast within the church, the ideas of the Pharisees, even likewise that Jesus was talking about in the gospel reading this morning as well. Which you gotta love how God works. I had no idea what the readings were going to be. I had sent a message to Pastor Mark and didn't get a response on what the readings were, and so I was like, well, I'll go with this. But it's amazing how it just always it just works out that it kind of fits with the fact that one of the readings mentioned Abraham, which ties in with this a little bit, and the other one mentioned the yeast of the Pharisees, which very much fits what's going on in the church of Galatia here. God works so much better than I could ever plan, I'll tell you that much. But it's the same thing that's going on. It's like, beware of those false ideas. They work their way through the whole dough. And so in this case, the dough is the church. The dough is figurative. It's an image of the church. And it's like if we were the dough here, and somebody has some bad idea or some bad, they're spreading something that's not of God. They're gossiping, or they're spreading untruths about somebody, or they're saying negative things. Like it's kind of like, this, if you've ever been in a small group of people and you got somebody who's always negative, that just works its way through everybody. Or at your office, maybe. I know the office I used to work at, it's like bad news spread through everything. And it was the contrary for good news to spread, or encouragement to spread, which was sad. It takes a lot more effort for the dough to raise on its own. But that yeast goes through, and it touches everything. It just spreads through everything. But that's what was happening here. There were some who were of the Pharisees, who were of, hey, you got to have this law. The stranger comes in the door. Oh, you want to be a part of Victory. Oh, you gotta get the tattoo, and here's this big, huge book of rules you have to follow, and then you can be a part of the club and get to know the head guy of the club, right? And that's kind of what they were doing. They were putting this extra burden on people, which was the exact opposite of what Jesus meant for it to happen, what God meant for it to happen. Right from the beginning, even if you think about it, how easy is God? God wants it to be easy for us to be in relationship with Him. With Adam and Eve, He didn't give them here's a list of 100 things that you can't do, otherwise that's sin. He just said, don't eat from that one tree. And it's like they had the whole world, they had the whole rest of the garden, yet they still couldn't follow just that one rule. But He had made it simple. He made the relationship with Him simple at that time. And then later on, because it's just of human nature, we needed those other rules on how to live, because we hadn't followed that. To the point where it got so wicked before, a couple hundred years before Abraham, where it was so wicked that God had to destroy the whole world because people just weren't able to do it on their own. They weren't able to figure things out and follow Him and worship and obey Him on their own. So then He gave them, a small list of rules, 10 commandments, right? And they couldn't follow that either. They kept twisting that. And then finally, He had to fulfill that with Jesus. And the goal of Jesus then was to make it easy, to make it free gift for us. That's what grace is, right? A free gift. We didn't deserve it. We don't deserve it. We're not perfect. We're not good. But God provided Jesus willingly as that willing sacrifice to take the punishment we deserve for not obeying. And so as we continue through there, what was happening is sometimes similar to how we are in church these days. Verse 7, you were running a good race. We start going to church, we start reading the Bible, we're praying, we're running that race. But then what happens, somebody comes along, either a friend or we see something, we see, like a false prophet type message somewhere, and Paul says, who cut in on you and kept you from obeying the truth? Like we lose our sight on what the truth is. We hear something, maybe we see something on Facebook like, oh, that sounds really good. It seems biblical, or it seems like a good idea, but we don't actually follow up and check, is it consistent with God's Word? There were even Paul even challenged people when he spoke to them. He didn't go to them and say, hey, I'm Paul the Apostle, everything I say is truth no matter what. He said, no, he was always encouraging them, whatever I speak up here, and I likewise would say the same. Whatever I'm saying up here, don't take my word for it. Check the scriptures, and if it's not consistent with God's Word, then I'm wrong and it's right. And that's what we have. We trust this book because, it's just a miracle how God has preserved it even through the years compared to other documents that humans try to preserve and get lost and twisted. Well, this thing has maintained itself because of God's power, and we need to take advantage of the fact that we have it, and we have it so available, yet we don't. It's so easy for anybody to get into it nowadays, and yet fewer and fewer people are doing that. But this is the truth. And this is like the light at the end of the race for us to look to and see like, okay, that's how I should be living. Yeah, I'm going to drink of water. There we go. Okay, that's how we should be living, right? This is our goal. This is the finish line. This keeps our eyes on God, on Jesus, what it's all about, the purpose of life, like I've mentioned before in previous talks and sermons. We keep our eye on this goal, and we run that race. And we're not going to be perfect. We'll stumble, we'll trip, we'll fall, we may skin our knees. But the fact is we still have our sight on the right spot. But then the problem is somebody comes along and says, oh, this idea sounds good, and we don't check on it, and we start to get pushed off course. And we start to lose track. We're not seeing the finish line anymore. Instead, we're just seeing the curves, or we're getting distracted. And eventually the race is going to be over, and we're either going to be at the finish line or we're going to be lost, and we're not going to be there. And the thing is, we need to make sure that we're always pressing on. And it says, who cut in on you and kept you from obeying the truth? That kind of persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. So we always need to be mindful is this something that's coming from God? I mean, you're going to get throughout your life, there's a lot of choices you have to make. And God gave Adam and Eve a choice in the beginning. He gives us a choice every day. Because if we didn't have the option to choose, if we didn't have what we call free will, right? We have the option to choose to love God. He didn't make us to have to love him, because then that would not be love. Like if your kids had to love you, that really wouldn't be love, right? If your pet dog had to love you, that wouldn't be love. If God made it so that we could only love him and only worship him and didn't have a choice, then that's not love. That's something, it actually becomes more evil at that point. And so he gave us a choice so that we could either choose to love him or not. Now the problem with the choice is the choice can be painful, because we can see it in our society, even in our town. A lot of people don't choose to love God, and then there's consequences for that. And those consequences can make it sad for us. And on the other side, though, there are good consequences. Choosing to follow God, Abraham choosing to obey and be faithful to God made him righteous. And it wasn't his action, as Paul said, and then as one of our readings said as well. It wasn't the actions of what he did that made him righteous. It was that he was faithful to God. He understood that God was in charge, and he was there to follow him no matter what. It's like God was his boss, and he was the faithful co-worker. He didn't talk bad about his boss. He didn't turn his back on him. He did what he was expected to do as part of being in that place of work, or in this case, in the faith. So as Christians, that's how we are to be, right? We should be looking at the Word, seeing how we are to live. And Paul gets to that too. But first we see a little bit of humanity in Paul. We see his passion, and we see his zeal for for the people that were being steered around. And we see how his anger comes out a little bit, because he was speaking of circumcision. Well, he wraps up in verse 12, as for those agitators, so those that are steering people away, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. That's pretty bold language. I mean, he's yelling right out pretty strongly that, he wishes they would just be purged from the church, and he wishes them mutilated, dead, not even there. And that's how we really should be with anything that is not of God. Negativity or the way we talk to one another should be the opposite of that. It should be the way it's referred to in the next couple of verses. It's that we're called to be free. Because of our freedom, we should be in. It should compel us to love one another, to encourage one another, to feel bad when people are obviously following the wrong person. And we'll talk more about that a little bit next week in the next part. But the thing is, think of it as if somebody, the example I use often when I'm subbing is if somebody is bullying you, because a lot of times kids are picking on each other, right? So in the church, that happens all the time too. People pick on each other with their words. And instead of being encouraging, a lot of times they pick on each other with negative words, or they joke around negatively or whatever. And it doesn't build people up. And the sad thing is, it's the victim we often feel compassion for, right? We often feel compassion for the victim, the bully victim, the person that is being bullied. But think about Paul when he was being stoned for what he believed, right? In that way, he's kind of the victim, but he knew where he was going to go. He's perfectly content. The world could just beat him down. It didn't matter, because he knew that he won either way. If he lived, he'd keep on talking about Jesus and keep on sharing with people and keep on trying to bring people into God's club, right? But if he died, that wasn't a loss either, because he knew he would get his reward. He would get to heaven. He would be in relationship with God firsthand at that point. And the sad thing is, the people that were stoning him, they were the ones that really needed the compassion. And it's the same way with the bullying, because we all know, bullying is such a big thing in the culture, right? And so we all know about it. And we know that bullies tend to be people that pick on people because there's something missing in their life, right? They don't feel confident, or there's something that they're jealous of, or whatever the case might be, right? And we need to be praying for those people. If somebody's bullying us with their words, we need to pray for them. And if we see something like that, we need to address it and not just let it lie, or not just blow it off. And it's that same way in the church, just as that yeast spreads through, that negativity. Think about our culture; it's so negative right now, and it's easy to be negative. It's one thing to point it out, but to carry it on. We want to be encouraging, and we want to point people to Jesus, because that's the one thing that can save us from anything negative. That's the one thing that can give us the hope that we need, that God has everything in control, that he knows where it's going to end up. And so it wraps up, says, so I'll just verses 13 through 15. You, my brothers, were called to be free. So remember, Jesus set us free. But do not use that freedom to indulge the sinful nature. Rather, serve one another in love. So because we are free, especially those of us that are in church, right? We should know better, right? So especially because we're free, we should be using that to serve one another in love, to build up and encourage one another, not to use it as an excuse that, oh, I can do this thing because God's going to forgive me anyways. But to always remember that what he did for us set us free so that we can share that with somebody else, encourage them, and let them know, because there's so many people, even in our community. I mean, there's hundreds of people who aren't in church this morning that don't have the knowledge of God. And we should be seeking them out. And whenever we come in contact with somebody, there's people within our family, coworkers, whoever, we should be looking for opportunities to share with them so that they can be free as well, so that their yoke can be removed. And so the entire law is summed up in a single command: love your neighbor as yourself. So keep that in mind, love your neighbor as you go out. And as it says in the last verse, if you keep on biting and devouring each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. So we don't want the yeast to spread within Christianity. We want to make sure that people are looking at the Word, correcting and teaching each other, using God's Word and His intent for us to be free and have that freedom, not so that we can do what we want, but so that we can have peace of mind, so that we can have joy and all the fruits of the Spirit that we'll talk about next week. So next time you make bread or you're drinking a beer, think about yeast and how that relates to God. Kind of like a treasure tote. You could put some yeast in a treasure tote, although it'd be kind of hard to pick it out from. So with that, we'll close with prayer here, and we'll continue on with our service.